G'day, mate. So I've noticed that there are two types of people in the world. There are those who have contempt prior to investigation and those who don't. And I've noticed with many low IQ types, they tend to have this surly, distrustful, suspicious attitude that just kind of vibrates off them. And that's understandable because if you were going through life where everyone was smarter than you, you'd probably have some contempt as well and some suspicion. On the other hand, I notice generally speaking, high IQ types, if they have no reason to suspect you, that they tend to be quite open and trusting, generally speaking. But if you ever violate their trust, then you're probably never going to get it back. So contempt prior to investigation. So I used to have contempt for spirituality. I always thought it was for losers. It was for people who wanted the benefits of organized religion without doing the work that organized religion requires and without being held to the standards that any organized religion has. If you're a Catholic, there are certain standards. If you're Orthodox Jew, there are standards. If you're a Seventh-day Adventist, there are certain standards. And so I thought spirituality was the easy way out. But then, after decades and decades of practicing organized religion, I noticed that I had these disabling emotional addictions that religion wasn't taking care of. And I'd always had contempt for 12-step programs. But when I finally realized that my own way of doing things didn't work, then I finally became open to attending 12-step programs. I think I went to my first one in something like April of 2011. So prior to that, I had 15 years of kind of contempt for the theory of sex addiction, contempt for 12-step programs, like admitting you're powerless. I mean, that's for losers, mate. But then I went to my first meeting. I was able to identify with something that virtually everybody who shared. It resonated with me. And I was changed, I was affected, and I realized, hey, this is good for me. So even if it doesn't make sense to me, I'm going to pursue it. So the 12 steps don't make sense, at least upon initial inspection. And the whole idea of admitting powerlessness, it doesn't make sense. It seems to be against the doctrine of taking personal responsibility. So I had contempt for something that went on to save my life once I finally became open to 12-step programs. So contempt prior to investigation. Contempt prior to investigation almost always seems to me, in my experience, comes from people who feel insecure. And so they are kind of predisposed to lash out at the world, to deny good things in the world. They're convinced that their problems are insoluble, or they're convinced that their problems are created by the government or by big tech or the banks or people who are out to get them. So this attitude of contempt prior to investigation never seems to come from a healthy place. And the healthiest people I know don't exhibit it. I'm thinking of an Orthodox rabbi I know, who's when he's asked questions about things he doesn't know, he says, I don't know. It's easy for him to say, I don't know. So I think the harder it is for a person to admit that they don't know something, the more that indicates a deep-seated insecurity, a lack of ease with themselves, which will then translate into how they communicate with others. If you're not at ease with yourself, other people are not going to feel at ease around you. And someone with contempt prior to investigation is someone who's insecure, ill at ease at the world, and needs to impose certain structures on reality that just don't match up with reality. So it's always been one of the major tells in my YouTube discussions when I hear someone offering opinions on a book they haven't read. I know I'm dealing with someone who's insecure and has some dangerously self-destructive tendencies. To express contempt for a book you haven't read, or for a movie you haven't seen, or a TV show you haven't watched, or an essay that you haven't read, perhaps on the basis of something you've heard about it, indicates that you're not at ease with reality. you're not at ease with yourself, you're not at ease with reality, you're not at ease with the universe, you're not at ease with your own limitations, and you don't have an accurate sense of self. So usually to be an effective radio host, you have to project this like tremendous confidence. You have to have a voice that comes through the radio and commands attention. Generally speaking, a voice that says, I don't know. It's not going to command attention, but that's based on falseness, right? If you are confidently stating opinions on topics you don't know much about, then you're fundamentally living a lie. So I think that's why many talk show hosts are very unhappy people. While there are some talk shows hosts who are happy people, like a Dennis Prager. He's pretty much the same on the air as he is off the air. So I went to the same synagogue as Prager for about 4 years. So the Dennis Prager you hear on the radio, that's pretty much the Dennis Prager that you would interact with in real life. So he's a happy guy on the air, he's a happy guy off the air, because he's fundamentally the same person. But if you're confidently proclaiming things that you don't know much about, that may be good for your career as a talk show host, but you're probably going to feel pretty hollow inside. I don't know Rush Limbaugh well, but it seems he doesn't have many friends, and he's had a difficulty sustaining relationships. What is he on his fifth marriage by now? So a great deal of talk show hosts, maybe even a majority, even of the successful ones, they're not fundamentally at ease with themselves or with other people. They're kind of awkward to be around. Kind of the very opposite of Dennis Prager. Is very easy to be around. He's naturally an outgoing bloke. People, really enjoy his company. Probably there's no one that I hear people saying, "Oh, I'd love to have lunch with Dennis Prager." Anyone more than Dennis Prager, because he's genuine. That's who he is. And another symptom of contempt prior to investigation, it usually means that you don't have an accurate sense of reality, an accurate sense of your own strengths and weaknesses. So what comes with having an accurate sense of reality is you recognize that there are things that you don't do well. So I started blogging July 3, 1997, and when I'd run into technical problems, I'd bang my head against the wall. I had all this fear about technology, and that made it difficult for me to learn new technology and to solve computer problems. So fairly quickly I learned it was a much better use of my time and money if I simply had people on call who I could pay $50, $60, $100 an hour to help me out with a technological problem. So coming to that reality, hey, I'm not good with technology. It's better for me to outsource it. So that helped. Also getting an accountant. So I've spent about $400 a year to an accountant who saves me that many times over in the deductions. So outsourcing my taxes to an accountant, I think most people benefit by having an accountant do that. So when I prepare my taxes, usually means about an hour, possibly 2 hours of work. I write down numbers, I gather documents, then I send them to my accountant. She comes back to me with some questions, I sign the forms, and I'm done in maybe 2 or 3 hours max. So because I have an accurate sense of myself that I'm not really the person who you want checking the engines before the plane takes off, I'm able to make my life a lot easier by recognizing, okay, I need to outsource computer help, I need to outsource my accounting help, and then other people benefit by outsourcing, say, marketing or web design. So Fiverr, there's a website, Fiverr, Fiverr, where you can outsource logo design. So I outsource under Fiverr my logo design for my YouTube channel. Various WordPress problems that came up for me, I just outsourced it to Fiverr. So many people find that enhances their life if they can outsource things that they don't do well. And that depends upon kind of having an accurate sense of yourself, an accurate sense of reality, and realizing that you don't know it all. What say you about patriotic alternative dropping millennial woes, Mr. Ford? Oh, I find it hilarious. The way that Mark Collette would talk about, keeping patriotic alternative a safe space, and he sounded just like an HR manager or a politician. At the same time, he says that his favorite authors are Adolf Hitler, George Lincoln Rockwell, and David Duke. Okay, so you are consciously patenting yourself as a Nazi party in England. So I'm not going to make any moral argument against patenting yourself as a neo-Nazi party. But if you're going to do that in the Anglo world, you're asking for nothing but trouble. You're going to have no influence and people are going to loathe you. So the idea that a Nazi party would drop millennial woes for being bad optics is hilarious. This is a guy who says his three favorite authors are Adolf Hitler, George Lincoln Rockwell, and David Duke. And he's saying that in an Anglo country, England. So you're already intent on self-marginalizing yourself. He already had his own incident where he was severely reprimanded by the British National Party, apparently for conduct unbecoming a neo-Nazi, having underage girls in his room back in 2006. So it's just funny to see the piety of his response. And it was funny also to read the piety of Millennial Woes' farewell message, where he talks about, I know many of you look up to me. Really? I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people who enjoy Millennial Woes. This is not a diss of Millennial Woes. I don't expect people to look up to me. But who in their right mind would look up to Millennial Woes? He's never held a job in his life. He's lived off the dole all his life and begging for donations. It's just stunning to me that he would think he has all these people who are looking up to him. And it was stunning to me that Millennial Woes thought his channel was really all about self-improvement. Millennial Woes, the extent that he was powerful in what he did, it was because he admitted he was a degenerate. He admitted that he wasn't really capable of navigating life, so he kind of retreated to the basement and spent all his time online, exchanging naked pictures with people and engaging in degenerate activities. Like, it was his brutal honesty that made him vulnerable and made him relatable for many people. But I don't think people were putting him on a pedestal. And so when he titled his farewell note, Dear Friends and Fans, it just seemed delusional. He was powerful when he was vulnerable, but when he turns pompous, then it loses his power. Okay, on his YouTube messages, he received numerous thankful messages and gratitude in response to his announcement. Sure, people appreciated his vulnerability, and people appreciated his brutal honesty when he admitted, yeah, I'm a degenerate. And then he said it takes a degenerate to respect tradition. I don't think anyone in his right mind wanted to emulate Millennial Woes. Like, nobody wants to take on that kind of life, would want their sons to take on that kind of life, would want their daughters caught in an intimate relationship with Millennial Woes. No one wants that. But what people do respect is his vulnerability and his honesty. And that came from recognizing reality, recognizing his own strong points and weak points. So yesterday I talked about gossip. So it's one of those things, again, contempt prior to investigation. People say they have contempt for gossip. We shouldn't talk about Millennial Woes. We shouldn't kick him when he's down. My point is that if you're interested in people, you talk about them. We only talk about people who matter to us. Okay, so people who particularly relate to the problems that Millennial Woes was sharing, who relate to his vulnerability and have similar struggles, they're going to form a very close, almost protective bond with Millennial Woes. And he established that because of his honesty. When you speak honestly, when you're vulnerable, it feels like the very molecules of the air around you change. And that enables you to form intense bonds with people, even with people you've never met. So people who have contempt for gossip, again, I think it's contempt prior to investigation. People never gossip about those who don't matter to them. That you gossip about someone indicates that they matter to you. The people talk about millennial woes this week means that he matters to them, that he's formed a connection to them. And so people may joke about it because I don't think, is there any revelation about millennial woes that could come out that would be more damaging than things he's already freely admitted? Right? Just on the basis of things he has freely admitted, he is not someone with a reputation to lose. Okay. If you simply take excerpts of things that he said publicly for public consumption, then there's no longer a reputation that can be sullied. He's already trashed his own reputation in the eyes of normies, and so I just find it hard to believe that there are any revelations that could come out that could damage him, or that I haven't read every poll thread about millennial woes, but I don't think that people having a laugh about his troubles can really damage him, because there's really nothing that anyone can say about millennial woes that is harsher than what he's already said. So in that sense, he's insulated himself from pain. Something that a lot of screwed up people do is that they're very upfront about their weaknesses or vulnerabilities, so thereby they remove your incentive to say anything that could hurt them. They kind of reduce their vulnerability by being so open about their shortcomings, and that reduces your incentive to go bag on them. Okay, I'm looking at an article I put together on gossip a couple of decades ago from the New Republic. William Powers wrote in 1997, "Undergirding all tabloid journalism is a rigid code of right and wrong, in which people are held to very particular standards of behavior." So it may be the closest we have today to a universal populist ethos, the ethos of the tabloids. So all the ancient social norms are honored. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not rape, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not commit adultery. But in the tabloids' reckoning of the world, and this is also true for 4chan and Kiwi farms, there are two sins in particular that have special importance: pride and hypocrisy. So what do Kiwi farm threads have in common? They seize on people who seem out of touch with reality. They seem to have an exaggerated sense of their own importance. So almost everyone who goes online and shares their opinions like I do, they quickly develop an exaggerated sense of their own importance, because they have people who listen to them, and therefore they think they have more power, more influence, more wisdom than they actually have. They also share things that they shouldn't share, that they wouldn't share if they were face-to-face with people and getting visual cues that we do in everyday conversation. So people doing what I'm doing right now very quickly spin out of control, lose an appropriate sense of reality, and get into a lot of trouble. But the two main troubles that people get into who share their lives online are the troubles of pride and hypocrisy. Okay, if you have an exaggerated sense of your own importance, if you have an exaggerated sense of your own influence, if you have a grandiosity about you that's out of touch with reality, if you have an impetuosity, if you don't have sufficient filters. Okay, we often do things online that we would not do in real life, because online we can just do them with a click. Or here I'm live streaming, so I can just say anything that comes to my head. If I don't have an appropriate filter, I'm going to get into a great deal of trouble. So people are much more impulsive online. You have a few more miles on the clock and notches on your sword, Luke. So anyway, anyone who does what I'm doing, if you demonstrate excessive pride, like excessive self-importance and hypocrisy, then people are going to seize on that, and they're just going to beat you like a bitch. They're just going to beat you down. So, when Woes is strong is when he's vulnerable, and he shares from his vulnerable state. When he becomes a target is when he becomes pompous and loses touch with his proper place in reality. So think about the JonBenet Ramsey case. The tabloid storyline is really about two parents who exploited their daughter's beauty to feed their own pride. And as for the O.J. Simpson story, it's not just about race. It was about a celebrity who thought he was above the law. So nothing raises tabloid fury or Kiwi Farms fury or Paul fury more than the spectacle of some e-celeb getting away with something or getting above himself. So to the extent that Wozy is attracting any fury, it's the extent that people feel that he has gotten away from himself or above himself. So in the pages of the National Enquirer, drug abuse, infidelity, and myriad other wrongs are often forgiven. But if you are caught pretending to be something that you're not, if you're caught being too big for your britches, they'll flay you. Right? We've all done questionable things. But if you pretend to be something you're not, and so Millennial Woes' farewell announcement, indicated a person lost touch with who he really is, lost touch with his own relative importance, that he was some major figure in nationalism, when what he is what he's often said at his best when he's honest, that he's an incredibly degenerate guy who's never held a job in his life and who's failing with reality and has retreated to this online world where he can be somebody. Okay, so Vivor says, let's not forget the patriotic alternative has banned him after the two matriarchs, Laura T. and Dion, passed judgment on him. And Mark Collette is a white knight of the second order. So I'm not really up to date on everything that Wozy may have done, but it's obvious from the things he shared on his videos that he's a self-announced degenerate who sends dick pics to women who don't want them sometimes, and who solicits them, and has porn addiction and all the other problems that go along with someone who's essentially shut in, never held a job, and is not really functional in the real world. And his power comes from his honesty. So we tend to look at movie stars and e-celebs and famous people with kind of one eye narrowed. We're ever vigilant for phoniness. That's what we don't like, when people pretend to be something that they're not. And once they do that, then we swiftly, gleefully cut them down. And we can be ruthless, we can be ugly, we can be cruel, but it's also incredibly honest. There's a lot of honesty on 4chan Paul and on Kiwi Farms. So the battle against gossip has been a long and unsuccessful one. People have always gossiped. People will always gossip, because if you care about someone, you'll talk about them. And if you don't talk about them, it means you don't care about them. So who's talking about Millennial Woes now? People who care about him. People to whom he matters. So we all want a good reputation, right? That's kind of our power, is that our reputation goes before us. But our reputation does not belong to us. Our reputation belongs in the minds of other people. We can't control or legislate our reputation. Some people may think they can pass laws and launch lawsuits to protect their reputation, but reputation belongs to other people's minds. We can't control what goes on in other people's minds. Now, choices we make, words we say, actions we do will affect how other people perceive us, but we have no power over other people's perceptions of us. So Would you want someone passing around inaccurate or false rumors about yourself? Of course not. So the golden rule with talking about other people is do unto others as you would have them do to you. So we should be conscious of what we say about other people. And if you pass along inaccurate rumors, if I pass along inaccurate rumors, it's my reputation that suffers. So that's why we have incentives not to pass along inaccurate rumors, because then we lose credibility in the eyes of other people. So the most famous rabbi in the Jewish tradition who spoke about gossip was named Chafetz Chaim. That's the name of his most famous book. So in the Jewish tradition, the leading rabbis have become known by their most famous books. So for this rabbi, he became known as the Chafetz Chaim. It means who desires life, he who keeps his tongue from evil. And if I was to abide by all the strictures that he wrote about regarding gossip, I'd not be able to do these live streams. I'd not be able to blog. I'd not be able to work as a journalist. Nobody would. Journalism would be impossible. Live streams would be impossible. But the Jewish teachings on forbidden speech are far more complex than what the Chafetz Chaim codified. So in Jewish texts such as the Bible and the Talmud, is filled with examples of Jewish and non-Jewish leaders being held accountable for their behavior and being called out for their bad behavior. So the problem with many of the reflexive religious and traditional teachings about gossip is that they focus on the harm done to specific individuals who are gossiped about, and they ignore the benefit that is widely shared among people gaining information from the benefit. So if you know someone has a promiscuous sex life and they have incurable genital warts, then by warning other people, sure, you're harming the guy with the warts, but you're saving other people from harm. If you know that someone is a philanderer, or if you know that someone's dishonest in business, or if you know someone's an alcoholic, if you know someone's unreliable, sneaky, shifty, then if you let unsuspecting people know this information, you are helping them and protecting them against those who could be dangerous to them. This is how the Chafetz Chaim was described by his son. Father had no personal relationships with anyone all the days of his life. So this rabbi who passed all these very strict rules about gossip, he didn't have anybody who mattered to him. That's why he wasn't interested in gossiping about anyone. So people who behave in an antisocial manner, extreme antisocial manner, such as passing on STDs, cheating people in business, misusing donations. Thank you, Sir Vivor, for all your good work here. So after a certain degree of antisocial behavior, you lose the right to be protected by prohibitions against gossip. So individuals who are predators, financially, sexually, lose that right. George Will wrote in a book review. Yeah, drinking juice right out. It's not juice, it's Crystal Light. There's no sugar in it. It's, I think, orange sunshine or something, sugar-free. It's so delicious. It tastes better than real orange juice. And it's good for my blood sugar. George Will wrote in the New York Times in 2006 here. So he's writing a book review about the making of the American conservative mind, National Review and its Times. It's a history of National Review by Jeffrey Hart, professor, late professor. I think I interviewed him on my blog about 15 years ago. And George Will writes, his book is a gossipy memoir leavened by a quick skimming of 50 years of political history. I confess, he says, to a fondness for gossip, which is a conservative genre. gossips do not want to change the world, they want to enjoy it. And Mickey Kaus argues that reporting on the private lives of politicians gets people more interested in politics. He writes, July 9, 2007 on Slate, LA's mayor faces some New York tabloid-style questioning at a news conference. The LA Times reporter, who didn't get the story, doesn't know quite what to make of this new state of affairs. I detect a mild, sneering tone. Luke Ford sees a beautiful synchronicity. So I broke the story about the mayor of Los Angeles. His marriage was over, and it became the top story in California in 2007. Antonio Villaraigosa, he was having an affair with a Spanish language TV news reporter anchor who sometimes reported and read stories about him on air. He was having an affair with her. Okay, James Lafon was the guest in the latest Myth of the 20th Century. They talked about coronavirus and Sparta versus Athens. Okay. I think Angelenos might be getting interested in local politics for once, which will give us better government in the long run. Special interests have less power when the people are paying attention. Well, what would happen if all the politicians in power are no longer womanizers? That's not a serious possibility. So whoever you're sleeping with, that's going to have a profound influence on you. And if you're in a public position, then the public has a right to know that they will be better informed if they know who you're sleeping with, because whoever we're sleeping with is going to have a profound effect on us. So the tabloid media multiplies and amplifies the many voices and viewpoints in contemporary culture, giving rein to many that are typically excluded. The shrill and revulsive response to tabloid media from respectable journalism and other elite social quarters indicates the extent to which tabloid popularity threatens officialdom's powers to regulate the discourse. This is academic Kevin Glynn. Serious journalism is far more concerned with controlling, organizing, and ordering the hierarchy of voices it admits into its discourse than is tabloid news, whose contents are driven by ratings and circulation. Liz Smith says that gossip is just news running ahead of itself in a red satin gown. Camille Paglia says, half fictionalized as they are, the tabloids with their twin themes of sex, of violence, tell the pagan truth about life. Okay, so Franz is throwing down a link here. Okay, he's got a link here to YouTuber named Faust. British liberalism and Anglo-empiricism are the foundations of scientific racialism. So, is he saying this is a bad thing? Jack Schaefer writes for Slate about a public editor column by the New York Times' Clark Hoyt. This is in August 2007. One of the flaws in Hoyt's thinking, meaning the New York Times thinking, is his belief that one's reputation is a possession like a car or a tennis racket, when one's reputation actually resides in the minds of others. A person can have as many reputations as people who know him or know of him. Positing that the top link in a Google search of a name equals somebody's reputation is silly, and Hoyt's column only encourages that notion. Whatever their shortcomings, search engines are 1,000,000 times superior to human memory, which they are rapidly replacing. The web also offers those wounded a variety of ways to manage their reputations and mitigate the offenses of journalists. By exaggerating the power of journalists and of Google to determine reputation, Hoyt's column encourages people to think of themselves as techno-pawns. I'm all for getting journalists to correct meaningful errors of fact, but if you want to secure a better reputation than the one that Google currently spits out, get busy and build it yourself. Okay, so the Chafetz Chaim was a European traditional Orthodox rabbi who lived from 1838 to 1933. His real name was Yisrael Meir Kagan Pupko. He's popularly known as the Chafetz Chaim. Okay, so Faust is arguing against the idea that racism is German. Yeah, Racism is a universal human trait. He was an influential Lithuanian Jewish rabbi of the Musa movement, which is a self-improvement movement, a halachist, meaning a decider of Jewish law, and an ethicist whose works continue to be widely influential in Jewish life. His most famous book is the Hafez Chaim, which means desiring life, and it is against gossip. So at a rabbinic meeting in 1910, Rabbi Meir Simcha of Dvinsk attacked the Hafez Chaim. Various rabbis made fun of the book Hafez Chaim because what he was doing was trying to turn stories, agadata, into halacha law. Well, Hazan Ish said that the Hafez Chaim just didn't know what he was talking about in this law. So the Hafez Chaim created halakha, Jewish law, out of Musa, ethical exhortations, frequently extreme. He took agadic stories, turned them into halakha law. He took broad ethical statements and turned them into Jewish law. I don't know anyone today, if they'd have the courage to say these criticisms of the Hafez Chaim, who's become much more influential after his death. So according to the Hafez Chaim, this leading rabbi, no gossip essentially is permitted even between husband and wife. Many other rabbis thought differently. Today, the Hafez Chaim in a bunch of Orthodox life is the last word in these matters. Though many rabbis, such as Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, would have the temerity to tell yeshiva students that they don't need to listen to the Hafez Chaim. He said that in a Haredi publication, but they removed it because they're too afraid. What are MREs? Let me look up. Meal replacement. Ready to eat food. So I'm sure there are some MREs that are kosher. So just look up MRE kosher. Yeah, there are military kosher meals. There are plenty of MREs that are kosher. According to Rabbi Jacob Emden, you could say Lashon Hara, gossip, about anyone who is your enemy. So I guess this is a justification for all the Lashon Hara that he tells in his own book. So Yaakov Emden lived 1697 to 1776. He wrote a memoir, but it's never been published in English because it would be so scandalous. He talks about wrestling with his sexual desires and all sorts of revelations that rabbis traditionally don't make. So there's never been the Jewish equivalent of Augustine's Confessions. Rabbis typically don't reveal scandalous things about themselves, unlike many Christian clergy. There are all sorts of heterim, permissions for Lashon Hara. The Meiri rabbi says that if you say it publicly, it is not Lashon Hara. If you read the correspondence of great rabbis, it almost always violates Judaism's laws of Lashon Hara. Now, these rabbis don't believe they're violating Lashon Hara. They believe that the target of their enmity deserves it. If their target does bad things, then they deserve to be exposed. Now, Mark Shapiro says this is a little depressing for many of these rabbis. It's just a personal weakness that they're venting, and none of them would admit it. They just say that they are exposing hypocrites as the Talmud commands. So there's an excellent essay that came out about a decade ago called From Principles to Rules and From Musa to Halacha, the Hafez Chaim's Rulings on Libel and Gossip. So in the year 1873, when the Hafez Chaim had finished writing his book, Hafez Chaim, on libel and gossip, he wished to publish it with rabbinical endorsements, as was customary. Since he also wanted to distribute the book among the Hasidim, he was a Lithuanian Litvak rabbi. He wished to get an endorsement from one of the prominent Hasidic masters of that time. He therefore sent an emissary to the Rebbe of Alexander. You can call me the Punisher Rebbe, as well as to a few prominent rabbis to give them a copy of the new book and to ask for their endorsements. The emissary reached the Polish Rebbe and requested his endorsement. "What is the book about?" asked the Rebbe. "About the laws of libel," he replied. "Why do we need a book on the laws of libel?" the Rebbe continued. Emissary: "The book teaches that one may not hurt his neighbor even by speech." To this the rabbi responded, "To hurt one's neighbor, one does not need a tongue or speech. It is enough to make a And he made a slightly dismissive gesture with his hand. Seeing the Rebbe refused to give him the desired endorsement, the emissary continued on to the other personalities, all of whom complied willingly. When he came back to the Havetz Chaim, the emissary reported that all the referees gave him their endorsements except for the Rebbe of Alexander. The Rebbe of Alexander, the Havetz Chaim responded, made a slight dismissive gesture with his hand. The emissary told him about his meeting with the Rebbe and the content of their conversation. Hearing that, the Havetz Chaim hurried to add an article to the book stating, "There is no difference between one who speaks libel about another person explicitly, one who does it by intimation. In any case, it is considered libel." All right, so what's going on in the chat here? I went to Wendy's yesterday. They were not selling double patty burgers. I guess I'm in pretty good shape as a vegetarian. Now, I wish I was not a vegetarian, but I was raised that way and it's become a habit. And so, unfortunately, it's a habit. It's a hard habit to break. And I've never eaten meat or fish. So at age 53, it would be a very big change. So back to Benjamin Brown's article here. When the Rebbe of Alexander insinuated that there is no need for a book that articulates the laws of libel, it meant that it would be better to leave this topic in the realm of principles. In this case, the principle that one may not hurt his neighbor even by speech. In the example that he gave, he wanted to intimate that one cannot cover all the possible causes of libel in speech. Is it that meat disgusts you? Yeah, it's a natural revulsion because I've never had it. Ideally, I wish that I could eat meat. I think vegetarian sucks. It tends to lead to depression, all sorts of dysfunction, to morbidity, to various mental illnesses. I think it probably reduces your IQ. We're obviously, by the shape of our teeth, we were born to eat meat. We evolved to eat meat. And it's healthier to eat meat than to be a vegetarian. Just look at the work of Nathan Kofnes on this topic. And that the formulation of laws would needlessly diminish the force of the principle. So you were born and raised vegetarian, but you went bad, and you didn't go bad in your 20s, you went healthy in your 20s. Were you raised a Seventh-day Adventist? Yeah. Vegetarians generally seem sickly. Absolutely. It's an unhealthy way to live. Havetz Chaim's response represents the opposite tendency. He thought that the norms for libel should be defined as all-inclusive rules. When he was confronted with a case that the existing rules did not cover, he sought to articulate it too. The traditional rule-centered genre in Jewish tradition is halakha. That means law. While the principle-centered one is known as Musa, self-improvement literature. Havetz Chaim's literary enterprise in this branch should therefore be considered as the halakhization of Musa, a legalization of ethics. So it was the Havetz Chaim who transformed Musa, or Agarata stories, into halakha law. In classical Jewish literature, there is only minimal reference, if at all, to the distinction between Musa and halakha. But in past few centuries, we get much more talk about the distinction. So halakha is morality of duty, and Musa means a morality of aspiration. So apart from duties to inspire, Rabbi Lichtenstein included in the category Musa norms, which are not binding, things like going beyond the letter of the law, piety, and other categories. So these norms are closer to principles than to rules. A halakha cuts to the minimum that the servant of God is required to do in order to fulfill his obligation to his creator. The Musa literature seeks not the minimum but the maximum, the path by which man will reach the zenith of religious life, approaching and clinging to God. Now that open cupboard door behind me is bothering me. I know you expect a certain quality of presentation here. I don't want to let you down. Okay, I want to know. Press 1 in the chat if you're religious. Press 2 in the chat if you're Jewish. Press 3 if you're Christian. Press 4 if you're an atheist. Press 5 if you're secular. Press 6 if you're Muslim. Press 7 if you're gay. Press 8 if you're transgender. Even if the Jewish thinkers of all generations gave little attention to the theoretical question of the distinction between halakha and musa, the living Jewish tradition knew well how to distinguish between them. So every bookseller of religious literature would put the halakhic books in one section. Okay, 5 is atheist. What's 3? Christian. Okay. 5 is secular, 4 is atheist. Oh, we got Rushton. Blessings, Ruston. And Bernard is secular, but he's on the road to Damascus. He's about to have like a spiritual awakening from watching these live streams. Wouldn't it be funny if a Jew helped to bring Bernard to Christ? Okay, so we got 2 Christians, 1 atheist, 1 secular person in the chat. Blessings. My non-denominational blessing goes out to you. Okay, so in the Jewish tradition, the prohibition against gossip developed as musa, meaning exhortation. So the prohibition, you should not go about as a talebearer among your people, which is Leviticus chapter 19, verse 16, was clearly considered a binding norm, but it was conceived throughout the generations as a duty to aspire to, not as a duty that can be articulated in concrete actions. And in the Mishnah. So do you all know what the Mishnah is? The Mishnah is the oral law. So in traditional Judaism, there's a belief that God gave Moses a written Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, and an oral Torah, which was put into final form in year 200 of the Common Era as the Mishnah. So in the Mishnah, we find the term Lashon Hara only once, and that is in an Agadic context. So Agadita refers to stories. The term Motzi Shem Ra, which refers to sullying a person's reputation, appears several times, and in halakhic contexts, legal contexts, but only in the sense of ascribing improper sexual behavior to a woman. So the language of the sages clearly follows the language of the Torah. And this refers to the limited sense that the term Lashon Hara had in the world. Buddy, you're a Christian. Okay, so for the Christians, press 1 if you're Protestant, press 2 if you're Catholic, and press 3 if you're Orthodox. So for the sages, the terms Lashon Hara, Motzi Shem Ra had a much more limited meaning than they did to Maimonides and his followers. So Maimonides was one of the first people who compiled a code of Jewish law. He lived in the 12th century. So for the deciders of Jewish law, like Maimonides, they used Lashon Hara to any untrue statement. So the term rechel, meaning gossip or tale-bearing, appears in the Mishnah only once in the sense of revealing a secret, but it's not decisive. Sages of the Talmud mention these terms more frequently, but their references are short and offhand. So they weren't using it within standard halakhic discourse. The only place in the entire Talmud where the sages deal with the topic at length is in Arachin 15b to 16a. We find both halakhic and agadic sayings integrated with the agadita, the stories in the clear majority. The two main halakhic sayings are permissions. Why do I use PC terms such as CE and BCE? Because I don't. If I said AD, I'm saying we're living in the year of our Lord. Why would I use a Christian term? Okay, Anno Domino, AD means the year of our Lord. We're living in 2020. I don't believe we're living in the year of our Lord. If I believe we were living in the year of our Lord, I'd be a Christian, but I'm not a Christian, so I'm not going to use Christian terminology. I wouldn't say 500 BC because that means before Christ. I don't believe that Jesus was the Christ. If I believed that Jesus was the Christ, I'd be a Christian. So it'd be weird for me to say BC or AD when I don't believe in their validity. So academics tend to use BCE and CE with the notion that religion does not belong in dating. So yeah, it would be weird if I said, this is 2020 AD, the year of our Lord. He's not my Lord. If he was my Lord, then I'd be a Christian. So Judaism does not start deriving laws about proper speech until recently. So the only Jewish text I've read in the last 15 years of reading used BC AD was a history of Yiddish, where the author expressed a dim view of Judaism. So yeah, overwhelmingly academic texts use CE and BCE. And just like Jews don't refer to the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament, generally speaking. If I believe the Hebrew Bible was the Old Testament, I'd be a Christian. But I'm not a Christian, so the presence of an Old Testament presupposes the existence of a New Testament. And as a Jew, I obviously do not believe that there is a New Testament from God. I believe that Christians believe there is a New Testament. So for the Talmudic rabbis, they understood that speech was not an area appropriate for specific articulated rules or for analytical discourse. And the medieval authorities followed the same path, except for one, Rabbi Isaac al-Fazi, the Rif. What makes the era common? Okay. Common era. Okay. Common Era is one of the notation systems for the world's most widely used calendar era. BCE, before the Common Era, or before the current era, is the era before CE, the current era. They are alternatives to the Dionysian BC and AD system. Yeah, said Old Testament in front of a Jewish girl, she recoiled like she'd been stung by a wasp. Yeah. To a Jew, typical Jew, they are frequently recoils, particularly if they have a Jewish upbringing, if they went to Jewish schools. Okay, the term Common Era stretches back to 1615. It can be found in English as early as 1708. It became more widely used in the mid-19th century. Wow, she was pretty strange. She wanted the Messiah to come so she could be appointed high priestess and save the world. Why do you think that's so weird? Okay, so Common Era became widely used in the mid-19th century by Jewish religious scholars. In the late 20th century, the use of CE and BCE was popularized in academic and scientific publications as a culturally neutral term. It was also used by some authors and publishers who wished to emphasize sensitivity to non-Christians by not explicitly referencing Jesus as Christ and Lord. Okay, but there is still disagreement over this. Some style guides prefer or mandate its use. Style guide for the Episcopal Diocese says that BCE and CE should be used. Use of BCE and CE in textbooks has been growing over the past 2 decades. Some publications have moved over to it exclusively, such as the World Almanac and the Norton Anthology of English Literature. I've heard some Hasidim won't write saint. Yeah, so yeah, traditional Jews may not like to write saint because it's so Christian. It's a way to erase Christianity from the public square. Yeah, I guess that is true. It is removing Christian symbols from how we talk about history. Absolutely right there, Rustin. In 2002, an advisory panel for the religious education syllabus for England and Wales recommended introducing BCE and CE dates to schools. BCE and CE is used by the College Board in its history tests. Is there anything in Orthodox Jewish teaching about a high priestess? Not of which I'm aware. In 2011, media reports suggested that BC AD notation in Australian school textbooks would be replaced by BCE CE. It became national news, drew opposition from some politicians and church leaders, and BC AD notation remained. So this is interesting. The Canadian Museum of Civilization, they switched for a while to BCE CE, but they decided to change back to BC AD in material intended for the public, while retaining BCE and CE in an academic context. So the use of CE in Jewish scholarship was historically motivated by the desire to avoid the implicit "our Lord" in the abbreviation AD. So proponents of the Common Era notation assert that the use of BCE and CE shows sensitivity to those who use the same year numbering system as the one that originated with Christians, but who are not themselves Christian. Christian calendar no longer belongs exclusively to Christians, says the United Nations Secretary General. People of all faiths have taken to using it simply as a matter of convenience. There is so much interaction between people of different faiths and cultures and different civilizations that some shared way of reckoning time is a necessity, so the Christian era has become the common era. So Adina Berkowitz, when arguing at the Supreme Court, opted to use BCE and CE because given the multicultural society that we live in, the traditional Jewish designations BCE and CE cast a wider net of inclusion. Some oppose the Common Era notation for explicitly religious reasons. Many Christians are offended by the removal of the reference to him in era notation. So some Christians argue that the use of BCE CE is a return to the most bigoted Christian colonialism toward non-Christians, who do not necessarily consider the time period following the beginning of the calendar to be a common era. And an English language expert said if we do cast aside the AD BC convention, perhaps we ought to cast aside as well the conventional numbering system, that is, the method of numbering years itself, given its Christian basis. So it was a student's use of BCE and CE, inspired by its use within Wikipedia, which prompted the teacher and politician Andrew Schlafly to found Conservapedia, a cultural conservative wiki. It mandates that users must always use BCAD. So Andrew Schlafly, he is the son of conservative activist and lawyer Phyllis Schlafly. Anyone watching Mrs. America on Fox FX? It's pretty good. All right, back to my fascinating discussion on Judaism's approach to laws of gossip. Okay, so Rabbi Isaac Alfazi the Reef, he extracted from the Jewish tradition some principles about gossip, and then he includes them in his legal summary. So the inclusion of these sayings within a legal work constitutes a clear declaration that the author sees them as part and parcel of the halakha. So it's like allowing some lady standing in a harbor holding up poetry to be the basis for your immigration policy. That's what happens when you try to set Jewish law according to stories and poetry. The Rif, however, was probably the last major halachist, meaning master of Jewish law, who viewed the prohibition against libel in this way. So if we rely on the conventional classification of books as halakhic or musar, the subject found its place as musar. Maimonides included it in his halakhic code, the Mishnah Torah. He wrote extensively about its severity, but only in a musar context. So Maimonides regarded Judaism's teachings against gossip as a principle and did not turn it into a series of specific rules. So he considers it perhaps more of a morality of aspiration rather than a morality of duty. So in the post-Maimonidean literature, so from the 13th century on, the boundary between halakha and musar crystallizes, and the classification of libel as part of musar is strengthened. The authors of the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch do not allocate any room in their comprehensive halakhic works to the issue of libel. So I'm saying all this because Jews who know absolutely nothing about Judaism, when you say something that they don't like, they'll often say, oh, that's Lashon Hara. Now, they know absolutely nothing about Judaism, but somehow they've heard that you should never say anything bad about anyone, so then they'll come, oh, that's Lashon Hara. Even non-Jews who know a little bit about Judaism will say, oh, isn't that covered by the teachings against Lashon Hara? And I'll say, well, Lashon Hara is not in the Shulchan Aruch. To be an Orthodox Jew means that you're obliged to follow the teachings of the Shulchan Aruch, which is a 15th century compendium of Jewish law. And the Shulchan Aruch does not include laws against Lashon Hara. It's also a linguistic indicator that the Talmudic sages and the medieval rabbis did not perceive libel as a halakhic prohibition. There is a halakhic category, habitual sinner, with regard to one matter that relates to a person who repeatedly violates one particular prohibition. And there are clear halakhic sanctions that are imposed on individuals who fall into that category, among them the loss of legal credibility. Now, this category is used only with regard to violations of halakha, not with regard to violations of musar, which is a duty of aspiration. So this was the face of the prohibition against libel in the Jewish tradition until the time of the Chafetz Chaim. But Chafetz Chaim did not initiate the halakhization of libel ex nihilo. He was preceded by a few important halakhas who noticed the lack of laws of virtues in the Shulchan Aruch and came in to fill the gap. But the Chafetz Chaim was the most famous to do this. An approach closer to that of the Hafetz Chaim is demonstrated in a forgotten Mussar book that was published 15 years before Hafetz Chaim, but it was probably not known to the Hafetz Chaim. So until the 17th century, the laws of libel were classified clearly as part of Mussar, meaning duties of aspiration rather than duties of obligation, not of halakha, which refers to duties of obligation, Jewish law. The only possible exception was the Rif, who lived around 9th century, 10th century, and his influence was tiny. So from the 17th century on, a few steps were made towards the halakhization of some Mussar norms, among them the prohibition against libel, but these were minor. They did not change the normative situation. The significant turning point that direction was made by the Hafetz Chaim, who composed a Shulchan Aruch of libel and tale-bearing. So for this purpose, the Hafetz Chaim needed to develop relatively novel tools. And I think that will do it for me for now. Take care.